Hello, everybody. I am so delighted that you are here. And so Danny right now is going to tell us about all of the great things that he has been doing over the past few years. Danny, you're on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singh. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm Danny Doucette, PhD candidate at the University of Pittsburgh. This is my PhD defense. I'm going to be talking for the next 45 minutes about introductory physics labs, and especially about equity in those labs. There's lots of people still coming in, so I'm going to delay just a little bit by saying that there's a lot of people on this call that have supported me tremendously over the last years and decades, and I couldn't have done it without you, and I really appreciate you being here and giving me your time. So thank you so much. All right. Let me kick things off then by sort of talking about where I'm coming from. I'm in Pittsburgh, which is on the traditional and unceded lands of the Shawnee, Lenape, Iroquois, and other people. The fact that we're on lands that have been for a very long time home for Native people is important. Pittsburgh is also a city that has been built on policies of racial segregation and is one of the most racially segregated in the United States even today. And that's important too. And I do work in physics, which is a discipline that has historically excluded women and other gender minorities and other people. And that's important too. My hope is that the work that I'm doing here is maybe a small step towards a future that's more just and more inclusive for everybody within physics, which I think is a pretty great discipline. If you have questions as we go through, please feel free to put small questions in the chat. And there'll be plenty of time at the end if you have some larger questions that you'd like to sort of unmute and ask. But I do ask that you save those to the end. Okay, so let me sort of kick things off then by talking about traditional physics labs. So for more than 100 years of education in the United States, science education at the post-secondary level, we've had physics labs. And the idea of a physics lab is that students will go to their lecture in order to learn lots of physics concepts, and they'll go to the lab in order to learn experimental skills and that sort of thing. And these traditional physics labs have usually been highly structured. Structure could take the place of, for example, a lab manual where there's detailed steps that students have to follow in order to conduct an experiment. And those experiments have often been based on the idea of either applying concepts that they learned in their lecture class, or maybe verifying laws of physics that they were told. So there's that. And also the physics lab traditionally includes group work. Students usually work in groups of 2, 3, or 4 students in order to conduct these experiments. And so this sort of physics lecture and physics lab thing is common in the United States and Canada. It's commonplace around the world as well. And the students who take it are students who want to become physicists, or they're students who want to become chemists or geologists who need physics as a prerequisite. There are also students who want to become engineers, for whom physics is an important sort of foundation for their discipline. And there are also students who are interested in health sciences, where physics serves as a necessary step that they need to learn in order to sort of continue with their trajectories, prepare for the MCAT, for example, for pre-medical students in the United States and so forth. So there's a fair bit of demand for students to learn physics, and there's a fair bit of demand also for physics labs to help students learn as well. But there are some issues with the traditional physics lab. There's, over the past couple decades, been an increasing demand in post-secondary that instruction is evidence-based. And for introductory physics labs, despite some strong and valiant work by some of the people on this call and others who aren't, that's not necessarily the case yet, that we have a very good a base of evidence for what constitutes good instruction in an introductory lab. We also have some evidence that maybe students in the introductory physics labs are not learning as much as we might hope that they would. There's a chain of research led by Heather Lewandowski and Bethany Wilcox and their collaborators that suggests that students' understandings of core ideas in it's sort of experimental physics actually decreases between the start of the semester and the end for students in introductory traditional labs. And there's also been some research, both sort of conceptual as well as quantitative, led by Natasha Holmes and her group, suggesting that in traditional physics labs, students aren't really learning very much in terms of physics concepts. If we sort of subtract the impact of what they would be learning in their lecture classes. And then finally, there's been some great work recently looking at how students with different identities have different experiences within these physics labs and within experimental physics settings, and how those different experiences can lead to either reinforcing or establishing or perpetuating inequities sort of from society into physics, and then perpetuating or exacerbating them within physics. And so we need to be very thoughtful and careful about how the introductory physics lab could be setting up students on a path to become great physicists, which would be great, but also could be sort of acting as a barrier for some students. If we're interested in making changes to the traditional physics lab, the first step, of course, is to figure out what the goals are. And in my case, that was one of the first things we did. We sat down and talked with all the stakeholders and said, what do we want this physics lab to do, right? Who is it serving? What are the goals? But after you've identified the goals, in education, we often think of a triangle, right? We've got the a triangle around the learner. We've got the curriculum, what we want them to learn. We've got the other students, so the interactions that our learner has with the other students around them. And we also have the instruction or the teacher or the instructor. And so thinking about all three of those factors, I think was important in thinking about how we could transform our introductory traditional physics labs into something that could be a little bit more effective. So that takes me to the overview and the plan for the talk over the next 38 minutes. I'm going to share with you 4 research projects that we've done out of, there's a few that I won't talk about as well. The first is about a transition from traditional physics labs to an inquiry-based lab. Next, I'll talk about a couple studies focusing on the need for equity and how we can think about improving equity within the introductory physics lab. And then finally, I'll focus on how we can train, in our case, graduate student teaching assistants to lead these labs effectively. And because I know that there's a fair number of educators on the call, I've got a couple slides of takeaway messages. Okay, so let's start with our transformation. So we've got these weekly 3-hour labs. Students work in groups of 2 or maybe 3 if we don't have an even number of students. We've got 24 students in the room, and they're being guided by 1 graduate student teaching assistant. Most of the students in our labs are health science majors, which means that they are planning to pursue a career in dentistry or medicine or nursing or something like that, or physical therapy. And typically these students are in year 2, 3, or 4 of their studies. And we also have some students that are sort of on track to become chemistry majors or physics majors, and they're typically in their first year. So we have a little bit of a mix here. I'll be looking at comparing results from traditional labs as well as our inquiry-based labs. By inquiry, I mean, instead of students coming in and conducting some work and following the procedure and making some measurements, maybe, they're doing an experiment that helps them to, they're inquiring and they're trying to find out something about the laws of nature from the little experiment that they're doing. And our inquiry-based curriculum, we adopted real-time physics as an example of this, has students go through a fairly large series of little tiny experiments and add them up in order to get some results. I'll be sharing results from 2 surveys. One is the Force Concept Inventory, that's a physics conceptual understanding survey. And the second is E-Class, which is a measurement of students' expectations and knowledge about how experimental science works that I referenced earlier. That's the one from Lewandowski and Wilcox and their team. And because I'm mixing up a whole bunch of students, including those that are health science majors as well as physical science majors, right? Students that are taking the lab in the spring and the fall. The graphs that I'm showing right here are based on linear models rather than actual averages. So these numbers aren't averages, but rather they're sort of like what we'd expect from an average student. So there's a very slight discrepancy that allows us to control for any differences like that. So let me just talk you through the results that we have here. On the left, we have the force concept inventory. So this is students' conceptual understanding in terms of forces. and kinematics and a few things like that. And we see that between the pre at the start of the semester and the end of the semester, for those students that are in the traditional labs, they don't learn anything, right? And I should be clear that our lab is taken after the students have already learned these things in their lecture course. So they're not sort of doing lecture at the same time on these concepts. So what this tells us is that the traditional physics lab is not, just like the Holmes group has suggested, is not helping students learn physics concepts. There are a whole bunch of physicists on this call that are saying, Danny, where are your error bars? I've hidden them because I want to show you something in just a moment, but uncertainties here are a little bit less than 1 on the vertical scale. So they're going to be fairly small. However, when we went to our inquiry-based curriculum to real-time physics, we see that actually, yeah, between the pre and the post, there is an increase in students' conceptual understanding. It's not huge, but then again, the students are only doing a couple experiments or only getting a couple hours of their time for this. So we're getting a little bit of an output from that. Just to move over now to E-class, which is our measurement of students' attitudes and expectations and how they think about experimental science. We're seeing that just like the Lewandowski and Wilcox are saying, there is a decrease between students' sort of understanding of how experimental science works at the start of the semester and the end for that traditional lab, right? And that's really surprising. One thing that could be happening is students are going into the lab thinking, oh, in the lab, that's how we discover the laws of nature, right? We're going to, discover some new laws of nature. And that's what we want students to think, right? In experimental science, you discover some science. It's very cool. But when they go into the lab, in the traditional lab, they're not discovering new laws of nature. They're just verifying stuff they've already seen. And so they're going to say, oh, I guess in the lab, we just verify stuff. And so their understanding about how experimental science works is going to decrease. One thing that was a little bit interesting was that with the inquiry-based curriculum, again, we're getting that decrease from the pre to the post. So students' understandings of how experimental science work is likewise not really helped by students going in and doing a bunch of small experiments designed to help them understand physics concepts. But if you think about it, that kind of makes sense too, right? Because here, they're again not discovering much about how physics works. So in an effort to redress this, in the last couple of semesters, we added some reflection questions to our inquiry-based curriculum. And what we would do is we'd have the students in their groups have a discussion and then write a paragraph, often they wrote more than that, response to questions like, why is it important for students to, why is it important for scientists to think about experimental uncertainties, right? Why is it important to think about error? Why do you make predictions before you do experiments? And just by asking these questions and having the students do the reflections, what we see is that instead of a decrease between the start of the semester and the end, we're seeing actually, if anything, a small, although quite small, increase in this E-class score. So I think I'm going to take this as a win, even though it's not a big increase, because it's sort of comparable to other curricula that have been studied around the country. About the best that anyone's been able to do in an introductory physics course is get these E-class scores to basically stay stable. Okay, so I promised one more thing. So I'm controlling for things like which semester the students are in, whether they're doing the health science track or sort of a physical science track. I'm also controlling for gender, but let me just break that up now. And if I only do this once, I promise. If I use very stereotypical gender colors of pink for girls and blue for boys, what we can see is that on the physics conceptual understanding, there's really no difference between the boys and the girls in terms of their ability to understand physics concepts. I think that makes sense to me. Boys and girls are equally good at doing physics. But in terms of their understanding of how experimental science works, there is a difference. And I think that this comes from the experiences that students are having. And so what this graph is telling me is that the experiences that boys and girls are having in the introductory physics lab are different. And as a result, the boys and the girls, or the men and the women, are going to be having different outcomes. And that suggests to me that there's something going on in the lab that we need to study that's leading to this. I should note, I'm going to be talking a lot about gender in this talk. My understanding of gender is that it is something that is performed rather than something that is intrinsic, right? I am male because when I walk into a room, I act male, right? It's not because of anything else. And gender it's non-binary. You don't need to be either a man or a woman. There's lots of other things, but there are two large significant genders, men and women, and there are differences. And so I think it is worthwhile to focus on those. John is asking about the green cap. The green is just the background. So the green is the background, it's sort of the average between the boys and the girls. So if I just go back a slide, if I go back a slide, there's the total. And then if I superimpose the gender, you can see that that gender is sort of splitting up a little bit. Cool, thanks. Okay, so we want to understand what's going on with gender in the lab. And so first thing to do, of course, is to do some qualitative study. So let me share now the second of those. Bob Devity is asking division between men and women for pre. Yeah, I just sort of, because I was able to control for that, we can imagine that on the pre, the men and the women are the same. And there's something that's happening in the class that is causing this split, right? So yeah, it really is something in the classroom environment that's causing this to happen. All right, so our qualitative study now. What I did, and Dr. Singh helped me with this, is we sat on the side of the physics lab for 100 hours and just watched the students in their natural habitats. We would come in, we'd introduce ourselves to the students, and then we'd try to be friendly and observant and take notes. There'd be a couple occasions where they'd ask questions, like if they broke their apparatus, and they're like, oh my God, what should I do? And we try to give them a quick answer so that we were sort of like acceptable in their environment, but we didn't try to jump out at them or anything. We didn't talk to them very much. We mostly just sat there and watched. And our goal was to see what's going on. And one thing that jumped out at us very quickly was that there was a big difference between how men and women were experiencing the lab. And that big difference especially showed up when you had groups of students that were mixed gender. So for example, if you have a man and a woman working together. And what we saw was that when you had a man and a woman working together, often they would take on different roles. And that's not completely surprising. I mean, that's something that happens in society. And Alice Egley has written about social role theory, how men and women in society often will be pushed to take on different roles. So we think that was happening in the physics lab as well. In order to illustrate, and we followed up with some interviews to try to understand a little bit more deeply about these roles. In order to understand the roles that we found, let me share with you a couple quotes. In the first, it says, in lab, I'm usually in charge of writing down the data that we collect, and he's usually the one doing the physical part. So here we have one student who is taking on sort of a secretarial role, and the student's partner is the person who's doing some of the tinkering with the apparatus. And so we call this sort of the secretary and tinkerer. And in the second quote, it fell on me to understand and get the group to finish the lab. I need to be prepared what's going on because they won't. And so here we have the student sees himself as sort of a manager, but also a manager with a whole bunch of other things. So they're the first to arrive, the last to leave. They're making sure everybody's on track. They're making sure everything's getting done. They're keeping track of time. They're the person who's talking to the teaching assistant. They're talking to other groups. They're the person who reads everything beforehand and makes sure they understand the concepts that they need to know in order to come into the room and get everything done. And this reminded us a little bit of the character of Hermione from the Harry Potter series, where we have this girl who ends up doing a lot of the work, and she's sort of just dragging along her male friend who is sort of adopting a slacker role. So we have a little bit of this situation where we have a couple ways that men and women who are working together can fall into two different gender roles. Now, just in order to build up a little bit of theory around that, we thought about that, and we went back to the interviews, and we did a little bit of a conceptual or heuristic thinking about this. I have some graphs here. There's no numbers on these axes, so this is entirely just a way of thinking about it rather than some data. But consider horizontally, we have something like initiative. And so the students that have more initiative, they're the ones that are going to come in early. They want to work hard and they want to get a good grade. Those are the ones on the right. And on the left, we have the students that are not like that. And then vertically, we're going to be considering a psychosocial dimension. So in this case, we're looking at gender, men on top and women, women on top and men at the bottom. But it could be something else. It could be race or ethnicity. It could be ability status. It could be lots of different things. And so what we think that we have been seeing in the lab is that if you have a man and a woman working together, and for example, in graph A, the man has more initiative and the woman has less initiative. Because they're working together and because they have that vertical distance between them, right? They have psychosocial distance between them. One's a man, one's a woman. They're going to be driven apart from each other. And so that man is going to be driven more and more into a tinkering role, and she's going to be pushed into a secretarial role. So as time goes on, week after week, they'll be pushed further and further in that direction. But I should say that like we saw this thing sort of start to happen from within the first couple minutes of the students being in the lab at the start of the semester. It's not like something that needed a lot of time to start happening. I think as humans, we're attuned very quickly to respond to stimuli and respond in this way. We could also have the opposite situation where a woman with lots of initiative comes in and her partner is a man with less initiative. Again, because they have that gender difference between them, they're driven in different directions. She's pushed into a Hermione role, he is pushed into a slacker role, and then over the course of the semester, they increasingly adopt those roles. People sometimes ask about what if you have two women or two men? If we have two women that have different levels of initiative, because they don't have that difference between them, they can cooperate and work together. And we found that they're able to share the work quite effectively as time goes on. And same for men. They will be able to cooperate and instead of being driven apart to different levels of initiative, they'll be drawn towards the middle and they'll sort of average out. One thing that we noticed in particular was that if you have two students with very high initiative, even if there's a very slight difference, right? So in graph E, the man has very slightly more initiative than the woman, that gender role is still going to happen. So he is still going to be pushed into a tinkerer role. She is still going to be pushed into a secretarial role, but she's got so far to go. There's going to be a lot of tension between the two of them. And we saw some conflict between students, sort of disagreement, nothing physical, but like disagreements and unhappiness about the nature of their collaboration. That happened when we had two students with high initiative that were being pushed towards these different gender roles. And the same thing can happen with students with lower initiative. Here we have, I think, a woman with slightly more initiative than a man. She is still going to be pushed into that Hermione role, but I think there's going to be a lot of resentment and trouble when she's pushed in that direction. Okay, so we have sort of a theory for how this might work dynamically, but I think the takeaway message is that when you have men and women working together in small groups, especially in this lab, they're going to adopt different types of work. They're going to split up the work. They're going to adopt gender roles. And you might ask, okay, so maybe that's happening, but is that a problem? And so we followed up with a quantitative study in order to try to understand the impact of splitting up the work in this way. So we're looking at students working this time just in groups of 2. So we ignore the students who are working in groups of 3. And this is based on a communities of practice sort of framework. And the idea is that when you've got people working together, they have a common mission, they have a common sort of set of skills, and they will cooperate with each other. We can focus on things like how they're able to share their work together or the mutuality of engagement. I see a question from Laura about initiative. We didn't really operationalize it because it's just sort of a heuristic thing. I think that maybe that would be a good next step though. And I agree with you. Yeah, I think that is something that I'd like to pursue in the future. Okay, thank you. Oh yeah, okay, so communities of practice, we're looking at when these students are working together, how well are they able to share the work, right? And we can think of sort of as a dichotomy, if we split it up into 2 ways of looking at it, either students are sharing the work equally or they're splitting it up. You're doing part A and I'm doing part B or something like that, okay? And so we're gonna, we put together a survey and did a linear model with some controlling for things like gender and self-efficacy. Okay, so let me show you the graph. And because there's a little bit going on in the graph, I'm going to introduce it sort of one step at a time. Horizontally, I'm going to divide between the students that have a low amount of equal participation. So these are the splitters. With the people that have a high amount of equal participation, these are the sharers. And we distinguish between them by having them answer the question, we participated equally in each component of the lab. Okay, and sort of technically what's going on is that we're forming a normal distribution, and these are being represented at plus or minus 1 standard deviation. But the thing to keep in mind is low means they're splitting it and high means they're sharing it. On the vertical axis, we're asking students to respond to a set of statements. This is one example of 4 that says, my experiences and interactions with other students, how we interact with other students, increased my confidence in my ability to do physics. So my interactions with other students helped me with my like self-concept and my confidence and my belief that I can do it. Okay, so is that interaction with other students a positive thing? Okay, so let's put the result from the men on the board. And what we see is that it doesn't really matter for the men whether they're splitting the work or sharing the work. They are equally likely to say that my interactions with other students, yeah, they had about an average amount of impact on my confidence, my ability to do physics. This vertical axis is a z-score, so 0 just means an average, the average result rather than anything sort of intrinsically meaningful. Okay, but for women, there's a different story. What we see for women is that for those women that are working in groups where they're splitting up the work, where there's a low amount of equal participation, they are much less likely to say that my interactions with other students increase my confidence in my ability to do physics, right? So if you're a woman working with a man and you're splitting up the work, that's not gonna benefit you as much. But for the women who are in groups with a high amount of equal participation, these are the sharers, actually, they're a little bit more likely than the men to say that my cooperation with my partner increased my confidence in my ability to do physics. And so I think there's a nice takeaway message that that when we're designing the work that we want our students to do in the lab, we should make sure that we're designing in and building in as necessary, sharing the work rather than just allowing students to split it up. Travis is asking, is 0 the mean of all 4? That's right. Yeah, what we do is we combine all 4 and then we make a normal distribution from all 4 of those. That's right. Okay, cool. So this gets us to a little bit of sort of advice for instructors and like a nice sort of pedagogical takeaway. Share it, don't split it. Which returns us then to this question of who are the instructors in our labs? And the instructors in our labs are graduate student teaching assistants. And I know that there are some graduate students on the call in addition to me, so I'll try to be as nice as possible. Graduate students are not always the best instructors possible. There may be instructors of necessity rather than ideal. A lot of the graduate student teaching assistants that we had running the labs were they were new to the United States. They were taking very difficult graduate student classes. They're doing their own research. There's a lot going on. They don't have a lot of time, energy, mind space to focus on being a really good instructor for their students. So our job, my job, is to try to think about how I can design a system to support them as much as possible. And what we came up with was a weekly 1-hour meeting on Friday afternoon to prepare for the labs that they would be leading the following week. I put together a website with some of the activities that we developed here. But just to share a few of the things that we did, each week we would always start with reflections. We'd ask the TAs to talk about, what happened last week. And the idea is that when you have people who work together sharing about these types of things, that can build your buy-in or your motivation to participate in the community and the way that you see yourself. The more I talk about the more I talk about my experiences as a TA with other TAs, the more likely I am to buy into the idea that I can do a good job of being a TA and I can support student learning really effectively. So we'd start with some reflections from the TAs. We would also spend a couple of minutes just talking about technical details about grading and the apparatus, but that was usually pretty short. And we would spend most of our time doing some training activities. One of my favorite is illustrated up here at the top right. I call it sabotage. I would set up a bunch of experiments and I would sabotage them in ways that students often manage to do by like miscalibrating a sensor or collecting some data and there's like a mistake, something that students often manage to find ways to do. And then the TAs would come in and they would role play. One of the TAs would pretend to be a student, the other would pretend to be a TA. And the job would be for the TA who's role-playing a TA to come over and help the TAs role-playing as a student try to figure out what the issue was with the experiment that had been sabotaged. And we would sometimes impose external constraints. For example, we would say, you have to help the student troubleshoot something wrong with this apparatus, but you're not allowed to touch it yourself, right? Or you're only allowed to ask questions. And these are things that we wanted the TAs not necessarily like to always do 100% of the time, but that we thought was probably a pretty good practice. And the TAs really liked it because they got to experience and practice what some of their interactions in the lab would be like, and they also get to see some common student difficulties sort of in practice. And we liked it because it gave the TAs opportunities to practice the skills that we wanted them to demonstrate in class. And we could also give them some feedback and help them to grow as instructors. We also spent some time helping the students strategize ways to address the gendered task division, the Hermione stuff that we talked about before. And another situation where, so for example, if I'm talking with Alice and Bob, and Alice is doing all the talking and Bob is just hanging in the background, and I as a teaching assistant want to drag Bob into the conversation and hear his ideas too, how can I sort of manage that conversation, right? So some of these sort of fundamental pedagogical skills that we want to, or teaching moves maybe that we want the TAs to develop. We would spend time on this. And so we developed this. We had the students, we had the graduate student teaching assistants do a writing exercise at the start and the end of the semester. And I spent more than 200 hours in total doing observations of the graduate students in their labs. And the idea was to provide an evaluation of how effective this TA training was. The results of that evaluation are here, and it sort of focuses on two things. The first is the TA training changing the TA's perspectives on how education works? And so what we did is we went through the writing samples that the TAs did at the start and the end of the semester, and we categorized them as either belonging to a transmissionist or a constructivist understanding of how education works. And a transmissionist view is the idea that in order for you to learn something, I tell you the thing, I've transmitted the knowledge to you, now you know it. A constructivist view is that in order for you to learn something, I need to create an environment where you can have that realization for yourself. And there is an incomplete but partial transition of the teaching assistants from transmissionist to constructivist views. I would say that that is incomplete. There are 9 of the TAs who in the post still had transmissionist views. I think this might say a little bit about how difficult it is to change people's minds about how we learn things. So it's a pretty fundamental sort of psychological understanding that we have. But that this 1 hour a week for 12 weeks or so was able to have at least something of an impact on the way that the teaching assistants sort of viewed the fundamentals of what we were asking them to do. Eagle-eyed viewers will say, aha, Danny, there are 22 in the pre and only 20 in the post. I've caught you. You've committed a cardinal sin of science. There's a few students that we couldn't categorize in either of the 2 categories. So those are just omitted. There's a total of 24 in both the pre and the post. The big colorful graph here comes from the 200 hours of observations. And what I'm doing here is I'm sitting on the side of the room and I'm categorizing all of the interactions between the teaching assistant and students in real time as they're happening. So these are sort of fractions of the total amount of time that the TAs were spending doing each of these different types of interaction. Each semester, there are 8 teaching assistants that are being observed and over 3 hours each. So it ends up adding up to quite a bit of time. Let me just talk you through the 3 different semesters. In semester 1, we're doing the traditional lab before even real-time physics, and there's no training provided. And the thing that I sort of notice here is that towards the start of the semester, the students are spending a lot of time observing. More than half the time just observing at the start of the semester. And then as the semester goes on, towards the middle of the semester, they're engaged in dialogue, they're discussing things with the students, but that discussion is closed rather than open, which means that the TA is contributing more than 50% of the words or more than 50% of the ideas to the discussion. So there's a little bit of back and forth between the TA and the students, but it's mostly the TA telling the students things rather than the students sort of suggesting their own ideas or trying to get some feedback or talking through some things. Andrew's asking if any of the TAs shifted from constructivist to transmissionist. No, I'm pretty sure the answer is that none of them did that. That's a good question though. In semester 2, now we have the training, but we still have these traditional labs. One thing I notice is that there's more, the TAs are more likely to spend time in open dialogue, so they're more likely to talk with the students. in such a way that they're listening to the students' ideas and helping the students voice their ideas. And also there seems to be a little bit more time in this sort of light blue category of listening. And listening is different from observing. Observing is sort of standing on the side of the room or the side of the lab bench, watching what the students are doing and sort of being available if you're called over. Listening is when you're part of the conversation, right? You're here, I'm making eye contact, I'm nodding or giving some nonverbal feedback, but I'm not saying anything. I think it takes a fair bit of courage to be part of a conversation as a listener, especially if you're a graduate student teaching assistant who is sort of viewed as the authority in the room. To just go over there and like be part of it and not feel like you need to say something. So I'm kind of proud of the teaching assistants in semester 2 for being more willing to sort of do this listening. And then in semester 3, we switched from the traditional physics curriculum to real-time physics, and now there's a lot more open dialogue. I think that this is probably a combination of the training that we're giving the TAs, finally aligning with the curriculum that we're asking them to support, right? Real-time physics, there's just a lot of opportunities for the students to talk and bring up their ideas with the teaching assistants, much more than there was with the traditional. Okay, sometimes people ask me whether more open dialogue is better, and like wouldn't it ideally be 100% open dialogue? I think that that's not necessarily the case. As a teacher, there's always going to be some occasions where you'll just need to stand in the front of the room and say a few things, right? And of course, there'll be other occasions where you'll want to sort of walk around and talk to students one-on-one or in groups or something. What I think I would contend is that there's a healthier balance of different interaction types in semester 3 as opposed to semester 1. And I think that my takeaway from that, at least, is that this TA training that we're providing for the graduate student teaching assistants is doing something to help the TAs move towards a more healthy balance of how they're interacting with students. Okay, so there I promised some pedagogical and educational takeaways. So I've got 2 slides of those. Let's take a look at those here. These are based on some of the studies that I just talked about, as well as some others that are that were not in this presentation, but that I'll link to in just a moment. So the first of them is that when we're designing lab activities, we want to make sure that students are sharing their work rather than splitting it up. That'll make the work more equitable. Second, when you want students to collaborate, I think it's important to make sure that we're structuring the work to support that collaboration. Jigsaw is a great activity to do that. Group-worthy tasks are fantastic. You should look it up if you've never heard of that before. One thing that came up a lot in our labs is the first time that students did a circuits lab, we would have some students that have made circuits before. They were in like middle school robotics, and some students that have never put together a circuit before because maybe their high school didn't have a physics course or the course didn't have a lab or something. And so if those 2 students were put together, only one of those 2 students is ever going to be building the circuits from the start. And then therefore, there's never going to be a chance for the person who's never made a circuit to start making circuits. And so they're sort of going to be deprived of that opportunity. And so, especially in circuits, but there were at least 2 other times that we thought about, I think 2, where there's like a skill involved that's a little bit different from sort of what we might expect students to come in with, where we had the students just practice that skill individually before they were allowed to start working together. So students would have to, build their first circuit by themselves. After they'd done that, shown it to the TA, after they got their first light bulb to light or something, then they were allowed to work with their lab partner. Another study that we recently finished is suggesting that when students have clear expectations and for the type of work that's being asked of them, as well as sort of this grade incentive. So they know what's expected, they know that their grade is going to depend on the quality of the work that they turn in, and they're sort of sensitive to the grade that they get, then that can empower women or other historically marginalized groups to make sure that they're participating equally within the lab. So I think that it could be a concern if I'm a woman and I'm worried about whether or not I belong in a physics environment to say, am I going to speak up and make sure that we really get the right answer here? Or am I just going to let those guys continue on with their, do the best they can type thing? If I know that it's going to affect my grade. And if I know what is expected, I'm more likely to speak up. And when I do speak up, because I can tie it to this grading thing, I'm more likely to be listened to. So I think that making sure that the grading is there and also the clear expectations are there can be really powerful as a tool for equity. We did a number of interviews with students beyond the ones that I described. And one thing that came up a lot was, especially for those students who were in the health science track, is that they like it when there's connections between their lab and their sort of professional interests in health science. So when they got to use a stethoscope, right? When they got to use the model of an eye, when they got to make clear connections between what they were doing in the physics lab and their other course of studies and their other interests, they were able to buy in a lot more, and they found that a lot more interesting. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And I think the what's it called, interactive physics for the life sciences, or the life science portal, are great resources for that at the college level. Okay, the fifth thing that we found that came up a lot was this often repeated advice, originally, as far as I can tell, in the physics community, dates back to the Hellers, Ken and Pat Heller, that if you're forming groups of 3 or more students, it's important to avoid situations where you have one student working with a bunch of men. In such circumstances, it's much easier for the woman to be ignored or spoken over, or I should say it's much easier for the men to ignore or speak over the woman, because she's just by herself, she's sort of isolated. And that can be a very painful and difficult experience, and it can have a significantly negative impact on women who are in such situations. So it's important to think about these sorts of things when we're making groups. But on the flip side, we also had a lab that we looked at where there was it was an honors lab, so there's a small number of students. There's only one woman in the lab and like maybe 10 men. And as a result, she was consistently left out, and the men would partner up and she was left by herself. And because she was left by herself to do an experiment that was designed for 2 people, that was also really difficult and isolating. She wasn't really given a lot of the support that she could have been. So I think that this guidance about avoiding isolating women and other historically marginalized people from historically marginalized groups when we're making groups within this masculine culture of physics extends a little bit more broadly, just to say, like, try to avoid isolating people, right? Isolation can be really painful and really difficult. Another important takeaway is to keep track of motivational factors like recognition. If I'm a person who worries about whether or not I belong in the physics department or whether or not I belong in the physics lab, and I'm told that I did a good job last week, that can have a really big impact. I think it's easy for white men like me to ignore how much of an impact that can have, because I don't need to worry about whether or not I feel like I belong. But also keeping track of how we might be impacting students' a sense of self-efficacy or their identity by the type of work that we're having them do. I think that's valuable. A seventh takeaway is that when we're designing learning experiences, it's easy to sort of assume that it's best to design for the average person, or even to design for people like me. I'm going to design a lab that I think I would enjoy. When we do that, we're ignoring the needs, expectations, the values of groups of students that might not share those with us. We conducted a bunch of interviews with, 4 interviews actually, with women that we sort of described as Hermione type of students. And their values and expectations were very different from the men in their class. And so I think in designing a lab, I want to make sure that I'm keeping attuned to these types of things. And then finally, as I hope I convinced you, it's possible to train graduate student teaching assistants, or undergrads too, probably, to disrupt some of the inequities that we see, like the gender task division, the Hermiones, the secretaries, as well as other discriminatory behavior in the lab. And this discriminatory behavior might not even raise to the level that we would think of it as being like a microaggression, but it's still something that we want to make sure that we're nipping in the bud. And I think that we can train young and new instructors in order to help cut these things out. Okay, it is tradition in our research group to finish our PhD defenses with a list of the papers and publications and presentations that we've done. So those are on the screen now. If you would like to learn more, I would be happy to send any of these to you, or you could take a look for them. My email address is at the top of the screen, and I look forward to any questions that you might have. If you do have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. You can send it to me as a private message, and I will sort of paraphrase it, or you could unmute and speak. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Danny. That was awesome. This is time now for questions and comments. And so I would recommend that people just unmute themselves. I think that might be faster than putting it in chat. So at this point, if you feel comfortable, just unmute yourself and ask Danny questions. Please, go ahead.
Hi, Danny. My apologies. This is a comment, not a question. For the wider context, I'm the Director of Undergraduate Studies for the department. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank Danny for all that he has done to improve our labs. It is just remarkable and amazing, and even more so in this last year. Thank you, Danny.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate that. Maybe Natasha, and then I see a question from Fran in the chat.
Yeah, Natasha, go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. Congratulations, Danny. It's so great to see the culmination of all of this work in one place. One of the questions that I was sort of pondering at the end as you talk about some of these recommendations is how do you think things might interact? So we've talked many times, I'm particularly intrigued by this idea of the role sharing, the impacts of the role sharing piece. And so I'm wondering, if you have the activity set up and collaboration really supported, does group composition matter anymore, do you think?
I think that I would want to bounce that question to some of the high school teachers who are in the audience, because I think that my experience teaching high school was that once you get the norms in place and once the students buy in, and once you've sort of established this community of trust and a discourse, then it kind of doesn't matter. Maybe there's a few like trouble zones, but it kind of doesn't matter which students end up working with each other, right? I don't know the extent to which setting up such a community might be possible or might not be possible in a semester-long college class. Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. I'd love to explore it more. My sense is that probably we want to continue to do both. We want to make sure that we're supporting effective collaboration as much as possible, but we're still going to want to make sure that we're not isolating women in groups, for example. Thanks.
Thanks. So
Fran asks why real-time physics was chosen instead of other laboratory curricula. That's a really good question. The truth is, I didn't make that decision myself. There's many factors that went into it. One is that it was packaged nicely and it's something that we could sort of bring in and deploy, published by a major manufacturer and by a major publisher. And that kind of does matter in the higher education space where you need hundreds and hundreds of students to get your lab manual every semester without delays. Another piece was that it is research backed. There's been some great work sort of suggesting that real-time physics can help students learn physics concepts. I think that the work that I showed earlier isn't quite as optimistic as some of those studies by Sokolov and his team, but that there's something going on there. And also that it is an inquiry-based curriculum, and there's some, but there's not that many out there for labs. There's not that many options if you want sort of a drop it into your lab and do it type thing, or at least there weren't a couple of years ago. I'm seeing at least a couple that are coming out now that I'm really excited about. And if I got a chance to sort of restart this project in 2021, I might look at things like the curriculum from Natasha and other people. So yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Fran.
So Gary has this question. Can you say more about share versus split by giving examples from actual lab contexts? What are some examples of sharing as opposed to splitting in some real life lab experimental setting?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think at first approximation, one way that you could split up the work is you could have one person as the tinkerer and one person as the note taker. You do all the physical manipulations and I'll write down the numbers. And we saw a fair number of students that did that. I think that that's a fairly natural way to split up the work. Sort of a second order approximation is the students can say, okay, I'll do the tinkering for the first half and you can do it for the second half, and then we'll split halfway through. We'll sort of flip halfway through. I don't I don't know if that happened quite as much, but that's sort of another possibility that could happen. This Hermione and the Slacker thing, I think, is another possibility. We also, I saw sometimes that students would sort of be creative. They would find ways to split up the tinkering work, and they would find ways to split up sort of the note-taking analysis work. And I think that maybe might have had less of a, like if you were doing that and making sure that you're switching week to week, that might have had less of a long-term impact on the students' experiences, right? Like if I got to do some of the tinkering this week and then next week I did the other type of tinkering, but still some more tinkering, and that might have had less of an impact. But I think that students definitely are, like, society is built on like division of labor, right? Like I didn't grow the breakfast cereal that I ate this morning. I think with that we are sort of attuned to try to split up things as much as possible. Yeah, I'm not sure where I was going with that.
So Abby has a clarifying question. You recommend no role assignment in groups?
Oh, that's a great question, Abby. Thank you. Yeah, I did some interesting work during COVID times involving role assignment. I'm not entirely sure what to make of our results. I think that it was effective. There's a qualitative study that would suggest that it is, but I don't have the quantitative numbers to back that up. I think that if you can have roles, so for example, just to make that clear for everybody, if we have a group of 4 students, you can have one person who's sort of the project manager, one who's going to focus on like doing the experimental work, one who's going to focus on doing like the theoretical work, one person who's going to be maybe going to be the note taker, right? So we could divide up the work in that way. Maybe that's an answer to Gary's question as well. And then make sure that we rotate this week to week, right? So if I'm the experimentalist this week, the next week I'm the manager, and the week after I'm the theorist. That's making sure that everybody's sort of getting equal opportunities to do the different types of work. Now, I think that if you have a theoretical or conceptual reason why it makes sense to split up the work in that way, then that sort of makes sense. You could think about how experimental science, like if you imagine like an atlas or something, like the experimentalists and the phenomenologists are completely different worlds, right? And the project managers don't do any science anymore almost. There are reasons in science why we do split things up. I think that if learning about those things is one of the goals of the lab, then it does make sense to include those roles. One student that I interviewed about this, sorry, I'm going on a little bit, talked about how different roles that she did were associated with different ways of thinking. And that's something I'd like to explore more, but I don't have a good statement about that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily.
John is asking, do you have recommendations on how to design tasks that promote sharing over splitting? I'm thinking of the circuits example you gave, as well as things like analysis. Seems like it would be hard for multiple students to work on one spreadsheet, etc.
Yeah, thanks, John. That's a great question. Just before I get to that, I want to acknowledge that Laura had a really great follow-up comment, that even if we do have these perfectly designed environments, students are going to be, they're living out in the outside world, they're getting conflicting messages, and it's hard to sort of shed that at the lab door. I think that's a really great point. So thank you, Laura, for mentioning that. John, in regards to your question, I think that probably this is where people who do lab PR have to earn their money. It can be difficult to design these things. One thing I played around with a little bit was taking a lab and saying, for the first 30 minutes, I want student A to do the theory development and student B to do the experimental work, and then they combine their stuff, and they're going to split so that person A does the experimental work and person B does the theory development. I think that there are ways to do that, but it's probably going to depend a fair bit on the specific lab and the specific content of what is going to be in the work that the students are doing in each week. Yeah, and I agree. Like splitting up analysis, there we go. It's splitting up analysis rather than sharing analysis, isn't it? I think it's a tough question. Yeah, it's probably too easy for me to say we should share it rather than split it. But I think that would be the ideal.
And I think Laura's point also is kind of like really important and difficult to account for in many situations.
Absolutely.
So it looks like John has a follow-up. Do you or any of those listed or any of those listed publications have good examples of jigsaw tasks for lab.
I don't, but the high school PER community has lots of good examples of jigsaw tasks. Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a great reference for you right now, but I'll try to dig something up and send it over.
Travis, you have a question?
Mine's a bit more off topic. I'm just wondering how you were able to implement a stethoscope in a physics lab, if you want to go into that.
Sure. Blood pressure.
Okay, I need a bit more.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a really cool experiment that was actually in our traditional lab. The pressure of the blood in your arm is going to be different if you raise it than if you lower it. And if my mother's on the call, she's a nurse, she would have been able to explain much more about this, the physics of this than I would. But simply holding your arm up there versus down here, there's a very clear difference in the blood pressure. And so you can make a connection to Bernoulli's law and sort of think about flow equations there. Yeah.
Thanks.
Again, I think that's a place where those of us who are trying to make new labs have to earn our money by figuring out where are these interesting things that are happening.
Other questions and comments for Danny? Please unmute yourself.
Oh, and credit to Russell Clark for coming up with that one.
So does anybody have any other questions or comments for Danny? Please go ahead. All right, then let's actually, I hear nothing. So I really want to actually thank Danny for a great presentation. And at this point, I think that everybody except the committee will leave because the second part of this thing is only with the committee. So thank you so much. Thanks a lot, everybody, for coming and supporting Danny. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. It means a lot to me. I really appreciate it.